What if I told you that the ancient predator from your favorite fantasy series, the one so massive it towered over horses and so loyal it bonded for life, has returned from extinction? Or at least, that's what headlines want you to believe. Recently, the internet exploded with claims that a biotech company has successfully resurrected the dire wolf. Yes, that dire wolf. The beast made legendary by Game of Thrones. Newspapers, social media posts, even some science blogs were buzzing with awe. The dire wolf walks again. But beneath the dramatic headlines, something strange lurks. Something most people missed entirely. Because when you start peeling back the layers of this story, a darker, more fascinating truth emerges. One that reveals not just a misunderstanding of science, but a deliberate manipulation of how we define life itself. See, this isn't just a tale about wolves. It's about the blurred line between extinction and illusion, between fact and fiction. And if we're not careful, it could change how we view every species on Earth, including the ones barely hanging on. So, did we actually bring back the dire wolf? Or did we just create something designed to look like our idea of one? Let's find out. Our obsession with the dire wolf didn't start with science, it started with storytelling. When George R.R. Martin introduced dire wolves in Game of Thrones, he gave us something primal, majestic, and deeply symbolic. Giant, mythical beasts representing ancient power, loyalty, and survival. They were bigger than normal wolves, smarter, more emotionally complex. Fans adored them. They weren't just pets, they were spiritual companions to the Starks. And then, like magic, the public began associating dire wolves with this majestic fantasy. When we heard the words dire wolf, we pictured white fur, towering height, cold weather mystique. But here's the truth. The real dire wolf was nothing like the creature we imagined. In reality, dire wolves didn't roam the icy north. They thrived in warm, shrub-filled landscapes, from ancient California to South America. They didn't grow to horse size. At best, they were similar in build to today's gray wolves, especially the Yukon and northwestern subspecies. And despite their name, dire wolves weren't even wolves in the way we think of them. Genetically, they were closer to jackals and African wild dogs than to today's Canis lupus. But here's the catch. That didn't matter to the media, or to the biotech company about to make headlines. What mattered was the myth, the image, the public perception. And that's where this wild story begins. Not with science, but with a fantasy people wanted so badly to be true. Before we dive into de-extinction, we need to separate fantasy from fossil. The dire wolf, Canis dirus, first appeared nearly 250,000 years ago and vanished around 10,000 years ago, likely as part of the late Pleistocene extinction event that wiped out many of the world's megafauna. These wolves weren't roaming icy tundras. They were prowling grasslands, forests, and savannas, sharing territory with mammoths, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. Most of what we know about dire wolves comes from an unlikely place, a deadly pit of asphalt in modern-day Los Angeles. The La Brea tar pits have preserved thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other predator. These wolves were heavy-boned, strong-jawed, and built more for brute strength than endurance. Unlike the modern gray wolf, which chases prey over long distances, dire wolves were more likely ambush predators, closing in hard and fast on large prey. For decades, scientists assumed dire wolves were just oversized cousins of the gray wolf. But then came a scientific curveball. In 2021, a groundbreaking study sequenced nuclear DNA from dire wolf fossils, and the results were shocking. Dire wolves weren't wolves at all. They belonged to an entirely separate evolutionary branch, having diverged from modern wolves over 6 million years ago. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the same time humans and chimpanzees began going their separate ways. So the real question isn't just, can we bring them back? The real question is, what exactly are we trying to bring back? Because it might not be what we think. In 2024, headlines exploded with a bombshell: dire wolves brought back from extinction. The claim came from a Texas-based biotech startup, Colossal Biosciences, the same company that had already been making waves by promising to resurrect the woolly mammoth and the dodo bird. This time, they weren't just making promises, they claimed they'd done it. Photos were released, huge, white-furred, wolf-like pups staring down the camera with piercing golden eyes. News outlets compared them to Game of Thrones, fans lost their minds, and investors opened their wallets. But behind the viral headlines was something far more complicated. What Colossal had actually done was edit the genome of a gray wolf. Specifically, they made about 20 targeted genetic changes across 14 genes. These edits included traits like ear shape, jaw structure, coat color, and eye pigmentation, all designed to match what we think dire wolves might have looked like. They didn't use dire wolf DNA. They couldn't, because usable ancient DNA from dire wolves is nearly impossible to extract. Most fossils are too degraded, especially those preserved in tar. So instead, Colossal used the modern gray wolf as a biological canvas and painted it with traits based on assumption, speculation, and style. What they created is not a dire wolf. It's a designer dog engineered to look like one. Colossal's chief scientific officer tried to defend this move by saying, "We're using the morphological species concept. If it looks like a dire wolf, it is a dire wolf." That's like painting racing stripes on a minivan and calling it a Ferrari. At first glance, the idea of resurrecting an extinct predator sounds like science fiction brought to life, something straight out of Jurassic Park. But here's the thing no one wants to talk about. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Bringing back the dire wolf, if it were even truly possible, wouldn't just be a flashy scientific achievement. It would come with enormous ecological, ethical, and evolutionary consequences. Where would we even release them? How would they fit into modern ecosystems that have evolved without them for over 10,000 years? What would they eat? And more importantly, who would they compete with? And let's not forget, even if we could recreate a perfect genetic copy of a dire wolf, we'd still be guessing about its behavior, its instincts, and its place in the food chain. A living organism is more than just a string of DNA. It's the product of environment, experience, and evolution, none of which we can replicate in a lab. But that's not the worst part. The real danger lies in how this story is already being used, not to promote conservation, but to undermine it. Politicians and policymakers have begun citing projects like Colossal's as evidence that extinction isn't permanent, or that we don't need to protect endangered species if we can just bring them back later. This thinking is not just scientifically wrong, it's catastrophic. Instead of investing in the protection of species on the brink, like red wolves, Mexican gray wolves, or African wild dogs, millions of dollars are being poured into engineering facsimiles of the past to impress investors and dominate headlines. And while the public gets distracted by the fantasy of resurrected beasts, real animals are dying in silence. Let's strip away the fantasy for a second and talk about what science really tells us about Canis dirus, the dire wolf. For decades, we believed dire wolves were just a larger, meaner cousin of the modern gray wolf. Pop culture certainly ran with that image. Powerful northern predators, white-coated and horse-sized, running silently through frozen forests. But modern genetic analysis has flipped that entire idea on its head. In 2021, a groundbreaking study revealed something shocking. Dire wolves weren't wolves at all. Genetically speaking, they split from the common ancestor of gray wolves over 5 to 6 million years ago, making them closer to African wild dogs and jackals than to the wolves we know today. That's like finding out your twin is actually a distant cousin raised in another country for millions of years. Despite the resemblance in appearance and behavior, dire wolves and gray wolves are a classic example of convergent evolution, where unrelated species evolve similar traits due to similar environments, not shared ancestry. Think of it like how dolphins and sharks both develop dorsal fins, despite one being a mammal and the other a fish. But here's where it gets even more fascinating and mysterious. Unlike mammoths, saber-toothed cats, or even Ice Age horses, we don't have well-preserved mummified remains of dire wolves. No fur, no skin, not even stomach contents. Just bones. And most of those bones come from one place, the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. These sticky pits preserved the skeletons of thousands of dire wolves, but also contaminated the remains so badly that retrieving usable DNA has been almost impossible. So when Colossal Biosciences says they've compared dire wolf DNA with modern gray wolves to create genetically similar animals, what exactly are they comparing it to? The dire wolf genome we have is fragmented, degraded, and incomplete. That means the so-called gene edits made to these new wolves are based on guesswork and aesthetics, not scientific certainty. And that's assuming those edits even reflect anything about the real dire wolf. We don't know what color they were. We don't know if they howled or barked. We don't even know if they hunted in packs like wolves do. All we know for sure is that they were successful Ice Age predators, adapted to a world that no longer exists. Let's talk about what's really going on here, because what Colossal Biosciences is doing isn't de-extinction, not even close. True de-extinction would mean bringing back an organism that is genetically identical, or at least nearly identical, to the extinct species. That would require either intact ancient DNA or a way to faithfully reconstruct a full genome. But as we've already established, we don't have that for the dire wolf. The genome is too fragmented, too degraded, and most of what we think we know about their appearance is pulled from bones and imagination, not biology. So, what did Colossal actually do? They took a modern gray wolf, a species that is not closely related to the dire wolf, and made a few cosmetic changes. They edited just 14 genes out of over 2.5 billion base pairs to affect things like ear shape and coat color. 5 of those changes were simply tweaks to make the animal's fur lighter. And none of these changes are proven to reflect the real traits of the original dire wolves. In fact, there's every reason to believe dire wolves didn't have white fur at all, given that they lived in warm, shrubby environments like prehistoric Southern California. So what we're left with is not a dire wolf. It's a designer dog, a gray wolf with a few minor aesthetic tweaks to make it look like what the public thinks a dire wolf might have looked like. It's a dog shaped by media, not science. And that's where the illusion begins. Because the average person sees a headline that reads, "Dire wolves brought back from extinction," and they don't question the fine print. They don't know how species are defined. They don't understand what genome editing actually entails. They just see something cool, nostalgic, cinematic, and they share it. This is Jurassic Park syndrome, the desire to resurrect lost giants because it makes us feel powerful, as if we've conquered nature's limits. But this isn't a scientific resurrection. It's a marketing miracle, built to go viral. And it's working. But the problem is, viral science isn't always valid science. Now you might be thinking, okay, so it's not a real dire wolf. So what? It's just a modified wolf that looks cool. No harm, no foul, right? Well, not exactly. This kind of scientific theater might seem harmless on the surface, but it has real-world consequences. Because when we allow flashy headlines and pseudo-resurrections to shape public understanding, we distort how conservation actually works. First of all, this narrative is already being weaponized. Government officials and corporate interests are using the success of de-extinction projects to argue that endangered species protections are no longer necessary. Why preserve what we can just recreate in a lab? Why fund habitat protection when we can genetically engineer a replacement? This logic is flawed, deeply, dangerously. Because the root causes of extinction, habitat loss, climate change, poaching, pollution, and ecosystem collapse, are not being addressed. In fact, they're being ignored, glossed over with a promise of a technological fix that doesn't actually exist. And even if we could bring extinct animals back, what good is that if we haven't fixed the problems that drove them extinct in the first place? Let's not forget, this single gray wolf cost millions of dollars to produce. Meanwhile, entire ecosystems are collapsing for a fraction of that cost. We're burning money on a fantasy while real species, critically endangered ones, are disappearing every day. For the same resources spent on this project, we could protect hundreds of existing species, restore thousands of acres of wild habitat, and fund entire conservation programs for decades. As marine biologist Dr. David Schiffman put it, even if we made this process 10,000 times cheaper, it would still be more effective and more ethical to simply prevent extinction in the first place. The worst part? This isn't just misleading, it's being marketed as hope. But it's not hope, it's distraction, it's deception, it's branding disguised as biology, and it's the kind of thing that could set conservation back by decades if we're not careful. So what now? So where does this leave us? We're standing at a crossroads, between reality and illusion, between responsible conservation and biotech spectacle. And the choice we make here will shape not just how we treat extinct species, but how we protect the living ones. This isn't a story about bringing back dire wolves. It's a story about what happens when we chase the illusion of control instead of confronting the hard truth, that nature doesn't owe us anything, that extinction is final, that saving what we have left is far more valuable and far more urgent than reanimating ghosts of the past. But here's the good news. We don't need sci-fi experiments to make a difference. There are real wolves, real forests, real ecosystems, and they need us, right now. They don't need us to play God in a lab. They need us to fight for clean air, protected wilderness, stronger regulations, and honest science. They need us to stop pretending there's a shortcut. There isn't. If you care about animals, about nature, about truth, then the most powerful thing you can do isn't to cheer on the next flashy genetic stunt. It's to ask harder questions. It's to vote for leaders who take environmental policy seriously. It's to support conservation organizations doing the quiet, thankless, but effective work of protecting life on Earth before it vanishes. Because the real magic, the real miracle, isn't reviving something long gone. It's making sure we never have to. If this video made you think twice about de-extinction or sparked your curiosity about how science and storytelling collide, don't let the conversation end here. Hit that like button if you believe real conservation matters more than genetic gimmicks. Subscribe for more deep dive, myth-busting content that blends science, history, and curiosity in every episode. Got a theory, a question, or a mystery you'd like us to explore next? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. On this channel, we don't just tell stories, we chase the truth behind them. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay wild.